Hi everyone, and thank you for watching this month's curriculum clinic on evaluating grading tools. The benefits of using quality rubrics are immense, not only for us as educators, but for our students as well. From an educator's perspective, a grading tool, whether it's a criterion list, a holistic rubric, or an analytic rubric, provides more scoring reliability. It also helps focus our instruction. When we know at the beginning of a unit how students are going to be assessed in terms of what they're going to be asked to do, which align with our end goals, that helps us as educators to determine what needs to happen in the day-to-day classes for students to be successful if they know, and we know at the beginning of a unit, how they're going to be assessed. In terms of benefits for our students, these types of grading tools create clear targets for students in terms of where am I going, especially when we share them toward the beginning of a unit. This can allow students to track their progress over time and constantly think about if they are working toward success on what our assessments are. It also provides valuable feedback. So asking the question from students of how am I doing and how can I close the gap between where I am now and where I want to be. When we can use these grading tools throughout the course of a unit to let students know where they currently are, they can then make their best decisions about where to move forward. So that means that all of our students, regardless of where they are, can move forward and grow. Thirdly, these types of evaluation grading tools provide guides for self-assessments. When students can see where their progress is as we assess them throughout the course of a unit, that can reflect not only where they're going, but it provides metacognition and self-reflection in students. In fact, one thing that's really beneficial is as we use these grading tools, maybe informative assessment or summative assessment, before that happens, asking students to self-assess themselves. Where do they think they're falling? It forces them to think about the learning product that they've created, what the goals are for how they're showing their learning, and where they currently are in that process. So it's a wonderful tool also for student metacognition and self-reflection. So without further ado, let's get started. So there are three objectives that are going to be attached to this curriculum clinic. The first is we're going to talk about characteristics of three different types of tools we can use: criterion lists, holistic rubrics, and analytic rubrics. We're also going to be investigating the advantages and disadvantages of each of them, because there are better scenarios and situations to use each of these tools depending on your division, depending on the task, depending on the class. And lastly, we're going to be practicing a procedure to choose a grading tool for a future summative assessment. So based on the unit that you brought in, we're going to be going through a process to figure out which of these three resources is going to be best for you. Now, in case you're interested, a lot of this information is coming from the text from Jay McTighe, Christina Dubé, and Eric Carbaugh in their book, Designing Authentic Performance Tasks and Projects. I wanted to make sure that I gave them credit. So let's talk about the first tool, a criterion list. So if I was making a criterion list, this would be a situation where the end goal or standard that I'm using is fairly vague, and using that language with students would not help them understand what they're supposed to be doing. This also works fairly well for particular APs or project-based learning, where students need more direction in terms of things they're supposed to be doing, where a standard or an end goal has multiple facets that students have to demonstrate. So a criterion list organizes that set of criteria and provides space for feedback and reflection. Because again, the benefits of these is we want students to develop self-assessment, we want them to think about their next steps, and we want them to know what success looks like. Now, the advantages of a criterion list is this gives a very clear performance target. It lists every single element that is essential to this particular assessment. It provides incredible clarity for students as they're working towards those assessments that we've designed. It also encourages not only self-assessment, because it's easy to say, have I done it, have I not, or have I done it, but it's not sufficient in terms of what my teacher is looking for, but also it's a very easy tool for students to use to peer assess, because it's not subjective. It is you did it, or you did not do that. Now, there is also some disadvantages here. They don't provide detailed descriptions of different performance levels. It's only, did you do this, did you not do this, or is it in some way shallow? But it's not giving different levels of thinking or performance. This is a very useful tool, especially for lower grades, kindergarten through second grade, as students at that point may not have the ability to translate a holistic or analytic rubric, and they may need more guidance in order to think about the types of learning that they should show. So let's take a look at two examples. So this would be for an elementary school fairy tale. And if I was asking students to rate a fairy tale or a piece of fantasy fiction, I would have to identify the different elements that I'd be looking for as an educator. So this is a particular criterion list for that. Notice it says points possible, and that can be based on what your school decides and has defined in terms of their grading and assessment policy. But there's also a valuable column here, not only for students to be able to say yes, no, or sometimes not really. Maybe if this is based on points, they could say how many points that's worth, as long as that's been defined previously. Maybe you could do it based off an ABCD category, whatever your school uses, or a standards-based 1, 2, 3, 4. This also provides a section for the educator to also say, here's where you are. So it's not only helping students practice their self-assessment and peer assessment skills, but it also provides a valuable resource where they can think, was my self-assessment accurate to what the feedback my teacher's given me? And this can be used throughout the course of a unit. This details the essential elements to a fairy tale. As we're going through these in a class, maybe we do plot first, and I give a formative assessment, and I can assess that using this checklist. It's also very quick to do. So take a second, pause, and look at some of these different elements here. Here's a second example of a criterion list, and this would be extremely valuable, especially for lower grades. Now, one thing I do want to note is that the categories here allow some flexibility. It would also be important for teachers to define what that means or give examples of what that means. But one thing to note in terms of the smiley faces, this is a wonderful tool to use. You probably want to avoid any kind of negative face or frowny face, because that may correlate not doing things well the first time with a negative emotional reaction in our students. So we want to be mindful of that, as if we use any kind of descriptors or pictures to describe different levels of performance. So you'll see the same elements that we talked about in the prior one here. There's also a wonderful spot at the bottom so students can think about what's their next step. So we're starting to build some of that more self-reflective feedback and metacognition here. So please pause and take a look at this a little more in depth. So here's an example of a more advanced version of a criterion list for a more rigorous class. This is actually a criterion list for AP research, and this is attached to a literature review. So telling the reader the story of the research over time with what topic you've chosen. And you're going to see the same elements here that you saw in the prior two. One thing to note on the right side is that there's a section that says yes, no, or not sufficient. And again, we're going to see the same elements here. One thing this does not include is a section for next steps. But if the teacher was using this over time and doing conferencing with students in more of a project-based learning environment, asking students where they think they're falling, asking them to show evidence of why they're at a yes, no, or not sufficient, and asking them what their next step is, perhaps in a kind of research or planning journal, is going to give that same effect that we're looking for. So let's take a second, pause the video, and take a look at this example. So let's take a look at a second type of grading tool. This is a holistic rubric. A holistic rubric is valuable because it gives an overall impression of a student's performance. So it gives a single rating or a score for what they're being asked to do. This is extremely valuable in elective classes, perhaps foreign language classes, where there are so many elements to successfully demonstrating an end goal or standard that putting them into one cohesive narrative is going to be more valuable than breaking that down into essential components like a criterion list or dividing it into multiple proficiency levels that just doesn't fit what the needs of the class are. So, a couple of advantages for this is it's very useful for simple products or performances, and it is a valuable tool for gauging overall student work or impact, including engagement, participation, if that is something that is attached to the end goals or standards of your class. Now, disadvantages, they don't really give a detailed analysis of strengths and weaknesses of a student's work. It doesn't break down their learning by specific elements or essential elements of that standard or end goal. And it's also a bit challenging for teachers to evaluate because there are multiple dimensions in a holistic rubric. What if one of those dimensions is at a lower proficiency level than another level? Where do students fall in that? When something's very multifaceted in a holistic rubric, making sure students meet every element of that can be a little bit difficult to assess. But let's take a look at a few. So let's look at a few examples. This holistic rubric would be useful for some kind of public service message. And this is flexible depending on the type of course that this is. Notice there are multiple elements for each level in this holistic rubric. Now it's fairly easy to create. You don't have to break this down to different elements and different proficiency levels for each of those elements. This creates a cohesive narrative for what you're looking for in terms of different levels. But you're going to see the disadvantage of this here. What if a student has a billboard, poster, or website that conveys a clear and compelling message that calls for public action to address a need, but the overall graphic design is generally coordinated? So what if they have one element in proficient and one element in expert? How does that get assessed? This would necessitate very clear examples of each level and clear communication with students in terms of what's going to happen if one of these descriptors falls into, let's say, emergent and one into expert. How does that get assessed? We want to make sure is students have clarity on what success looks like. Now, this is also very valuable for student self-assessment feedback. If we were working toward a particular performance task and doing formative assessments as we're learning how to do a public service message, I could highlight where they're falling for each of these categories. The question would be then, all right, well, what does that correlate to in terms of, quote, a grade or a proficiency level, depending on the school that we're in? This is one of the disadvantages, but they're fairly easy to make, and depending on the class, this would be a better choice for you. Here's another example of a holistic rubric, and this would be for a scientific investigation. Again, pause this video, take a look, and you're going to see those same elements that we talked about earlier. I want to give one more example of a holistic rubric, and this would be for a course that doesn't have different proficiency levels. For example, again, this is an AP research rubric for a literature review. And what this has done is, even though it's differentiated different elements, actually, yeah, don't use this because that's not going to work. Yeah, don't use this. So now we're going to stop here, stop share. So lastly, let's talk about an analytic rubric. This is a more traditional type of grading tool that you usually think of when you hear the word rubric. This is when you have multiple standards or end goals, and you divide that product or performance into different criteria and different proficiency levels. Now, this is a traditional type of grading tool, and the reason is it has a lot of advantages. It helps to evaluate complex projects or performances, because it not only identifies significant end goals and essential criteria, but shows different levels of thinking and performance that students can track over time and get feedback on where they are. And this allows for different significant dimensions. This also allows you as the educator to highlight where their strengths and weaknesses are. And it creates more clarity in terms of how this can be assessed. So whereas a holistic rubric, what happens if you have one criteria in expert, one criteria in proficient? This doesn't have that problem because it not only highlights this by essential criteria, but shows descriptions of different proficiency levels. And this creates more specific information to students, parents, and teachers with strengths and weaknesses of students. And this can be very useful for feedback because this lets the student and teacher know different areas of need that can then be used for very valuable feedback and can be tracked to see if students use that feedback and they're learning and growing. Now, the disadvantage to this is it takes more time than the other two options to create. Again, this isn't useful for every single class or division, but in most cases, this is an extremely useful tool for meeting those different types of outcomes and goals that we want for a grading tool. So let's take a look at a few examples. So this would be an analytic rubric for a history 9th to 10th grade class. So you can see that the standard is over on the left. And notice that because there are two different essential criteria in this standard, each of these proficiency levels highlights that. So take a second, pause the video, and take a look at this rubric. One thing to think about in this rubric is that not only can students see, oh, here's how I can show my learning and growth over time. It provides a very clear description of what success looks like, and it's going to be very useful for students and educators as we're trying to figure out where students are as they are learning this skill throughout the course of a unit. Let's take a look at a second example. Now, what you'll notice here is that instead of 4 proficiency levels, this particular standard has 3 proficiency levels, and that's okay. An analytic rubric does not have to be a typical 4-level rubric. If a particular standard or end goal can't be broken down into that many different levels of thinking, it needs to be broken down into however many there are. So you can have 3 proficiency level analytic rubrics or 2 proficiency level analytic rubrics. It depends on the particular standard. When you're looking at this particular standard, another really useful tool to use is the idea of or and the idea of and. That helps differentiate different skills in terms of these grading tools. So take a second, pause the video, and let's see what elements we're seeing here. So here's another example of an analytic rubric that is actually 1 proficiency level. Now, you would use a rubric like this in a class where students could not move forward until they demonstrated proficiency on essential criteria. This is for an AP research class, and this is for the lit review. In a class where you were working on one thing for an extended period of time, like AP research, students cannot move forward until they've demonstrated proficiency with a lit review. So because there's only one goal that students have to hit, you can use a 1 proficiency rubric. This also works in performance-based electives, specifically art or music, where using some descriptions of different levels would be quite difficult, and you couldn't let students move forward until they demonstrate proficiency with these things. So you have the standard in the middle, identifying the 4 essential criteria of a lit review, and it provides columns on the left and right for valuable feedback in terms of are students first meeting that standard, and what are they especially doing well, and what are their areas of growth. This is extremely valuable for students in terms of self-assessment and peer assessment, because not only can they identify, did I meet the proficiency level to move forward, but again, what have I done really well? What do I individually need to do to grow? And having 2 of those analytic rubrics back to back, one that a student did and one that a teacher did, allows them to see, is my teacher seeing the same things that I did? And as an educator, I can see some thinking from students or areas of growth from students that maybe I didn't even think about. It's an extremely valuable tool depending on the class. So here's the important question. What's important here? There's no real answer for what is the best grading tool to use, depending on the class, depending on the unit. The answer really depends on what you are asking students to do in terms of the performance task or in terms of the project. So you want to choose the best one that's going to fit what you're asking students to do. So here are a set of guiding questions that can be useful as we're trying to determine what type of evaluating tool to use. Now, we're going to be doing this all together. That's why I asked you to bring in a unit of instruction. We're going to be working on this one-on-one, but these are a wonderful set of questions that you can use as you're continuing to choose and develop grading tools in the future. And lastly, here is a wonderful tool to evaluate if the criteria list, holistic rubric, or analytic rubric you're using is to the particular standard that would best meet the needs of your students. Again, I'm not going to read this out for you, but one thing I do want to highlight is just because a grading tool would have some elements in a 2, that does not mean that the grading tool needs to be revised. Sometimes it would be sufficient to have a criteria that is explained in some degree based on the needs of the class. And what we're going to be doing is using this with a particular unit of study that you brought in. This is also an extremely valuable tool to use as you're developing and identifying the grading tools that are going to be most valuable for your students. So what we're going to be doing together is using those guiding questions and grading tool examples. So we're going to choose a particular learning standard or end goal that you brought in from a unit. We're going to try to use those guiding questions to identify the best grading tool to assess that goal. And if we have time, we're going to try and create that grading tool all together using each other as a resource for help. And if we can get that done, we'll even assess it using the criteria for reviewing a grading tool. So for those of you who are watching this in a video format, if you go through this process and not only identify a grading tool, but create that grading tool and assess it, send that feedback over or send the grading tool and the performance task or project over. I'm happy to also give feedback. We learn best when we all move forward together. We're all in a process of becoming, we are all lifelong learners. So I would be happy to partner with you and collaborate you as we're all learning and growing. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day.